Climate People and Climate People in an Environment Program seminar. For those who don't know, I'm Ankur Desai, CPEP professor and organizer of the seminar series. Those who came last week heard a fantastic talk from Professor Andrea Dutton about sea level and continuing our theme of trying to understand using isotopes. And so maybe more in somewhat related work, also thinking about the Arctic and the ocean, but now from a biological perspective. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Dr. Miguel Goni from Oregon State University. Miguel got his undergraduate and doctoral degrees both in oceanography at the University of Washington, and then joined the Oregon State University. Well, previously was the University of South Carolina, and then went to the Oregon State University, where he's been doing a whole variety of really fascinating research in marine biogeochemistry, global biogeochemical cycling, paleoceanography, especially of high latitude oceans, but a whole variety of different systems. I've had the pleasure of having known Miguel for quite some time. He was the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Geophysical Research Biogeosciences, where I served with him as an editor. And so we've had many, many chats about many things. And I've also learned a lot about oceanography, and I know his field schedule very well, having taken over for him many times when he's constantly disappeared on a ship somewhere in the Arctic. And then he sends back these amazing pictures. And when he's not doing that, when he's out hunting for Wikipedia as well. So Miguel is an amazing scholar. I'm sure he's going to show you some beautiful pictures also of the stuff he does in the field. Today, we're going to be hearing a little bit about organic matter in the emerging ice-free Arctic. And this is, of course, a topic that is also relevant to the work that we've done here at UW with the recent emerging polar regions cluster hire across AOS Geoscience, and of course, involving CCR for all of the hires. And actually one of those polar cluster speakers will be our next speaker next month, Min Chen from Forest Ecology. He'll talk a little bit more about Arctic terrestrial ecosystems. But before we jump the gun on that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Goni and let you share your screen.
All right, great. Thank you so much for the introduction. And let's see, hopefully everybody can sort of see the screen, right? Yeah, well, thank you so much, Ankur, for inviting me. And I'm glad to maybe give you a quick overview of some of the more recent work we've been doing in the Arctic. So yeah, so like Ankur said, I'm an oceanographer by training. I'm an organic biogeochemist, look at organic matter. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the understanding towards the understanding of the new Arctic, and mostly from the point of view of just the fact that the Arctic Ocean is becoming progressively more ice-free. Let's see, let me put this in here. And, so before I do that, I want to acknowledge a large number of people. Most of you know that without students and collaborators, technicians, it's impossible to do the kind of work that we do. Most of us work on multidisciplinary science. So lots of PIs, colleagues from various institutions, lots of students and technicians that really help make this work. Most of the work I'm going to show you is on large research vessels, and so the captains and crews of those research vessels are incredibly important to make things work, and of course the funding, which is critical. I just want to highlight a couple people. So Bailey Welch is she was an undergraduate student in my lab and eventually became my lab manager and technician. So she's been great. Lori Juranek will show some data for work on dissolved gases, is also a great colleague. Rachel Sipler is also a very important colleague of mine with whom we have worked. And then of course the students of my group that help go out, collect data, analyze samples, and make some of this results possible. I know that I got an introduction, and so since I don't know many of you or most of you, I thought I'd introduce myself to you briefly. I'm a field oceanographer. I work mostly on collecting data and samples in situ. I work mostly on both sediment and water water column processes. My focus is carbon in natural environments, organic matter in natural environments. And I mostly use analytical techniques to make those measurements and chemical measurements. And then I teach field field courses, which I really enjoyed, which have been suffering because of the pandemic. We haven't been able to have them. And then just a quick overview of my personal interests. I love the outdoors. I've been now lived in the Pacific Northwest for almost 16 years now, and enjoyed all the great things that the outdoors in our region have to offer. Okay, so with that done, let me jump into kind of the meat of the talk. So, I mean, I don't have to say too many things about this. It is clear. We all know it. We have read the papers. We know that the Arctic is warming at a higher rate than other places on the Earth, and that warming is causing all sorts of changes. The kind of change that I want to focus on is one that maybe some of you haven't really thought too much about, but it's the idea that, or the fact that as the Arctic warms, we're progressively losing sea ice. And so I'll talk a little more about sea ice in a minute, but there's a couple pictures here that kind of illustrate. So here's a kind of a top of the world view of the Arctic Ocean. So the Arctic Ocean, of course, is the North Pole is an ocean pole as opposed to Antarctica. There are, of course, ice, Greenland ice sheets and other glaciers all around. But the key thing that we're focusing in this talk is that in the summertime, the end of the summer, which is typically September, throughout the past 2 decades, the Arctic ice receded up to about this line. And in the last few decades, that recession of that summer Arctic ice has increased to the point where, so here's in 2019 showing just how large that change in terms of ice coverage during the summer especially has become. And again, there's different pictures. NASA creates great photographs and sort of views of just how the reduction. So again, this is just to sort of highlight the fact that it's about a 50% reduction in ice coverage during the summertime when the ice typically melts, but is melting at a much higher rate. Now, this is not just something that has happened the last couple of decades. It's not something that we are just seeing now because, well, now we have satellites and we can measure. So we are pretty sure we should say that this is a process that is happening at at timescales that suggest a major change. And so this is from a recent paper on ice volume variability and using modeling to kind of see that, of course, there's interannual variability in the past, and that's what we expect. But what we've seen since the 1980s is a really, really steady decrease on that ice volume that suggests that we are going towards a large ecological or large environmental change that has quite a few ecological problems, ecological consequences, I should say. Now, there's lots of papers in sort of the effect of this warming and what's happening in terms of other parts of the ocean. So the export of sea ice from the ocean is changing because of these trends. And so again, I don't want to go too much into it, but those have impacts that go beyond just the Arctic and impact other parts of the ocean. And in fact, if you've been reading and listened to the news, even we are pretty clear, and again, I probably don't have to convince anybody that even weather patterns in other parts of the world, of course, are being highly impacted by the Arctic warming. So the Arctic warming is creating major changes, it's creating major environmental changes globally, but in the Arctic region, really some major impacts. And again, there are some great recent papers that kind of review this. So this is from Earth's Future, a new AGU journal, a really nice review of just all the impacts that it has. And I'll just highlight a couple of things. There's loss of sea ice is one of the ones that is highlighted here. And then, that tends to accelerate some of the other climate changes by albedo and other feedbacks. but the other thing that they really they talk about, and I guess you guys heard about rising sea level, and then increased coastal erosion, primarily due to this rising sea level and the increased amount of ice-free conditions. So we hear about it on the news. Everybody is familiar with the plight of some of the iconic Arctic species like the polar bear that depend on ice as a way of surviving. So that's, again, something that you don't have to read papers. You can just sort of listen to the news. And what you can see, if you follow this, you'll see that the public in general are finding lots of articles and communications related to kind of this large sea ice loss, really opening up some major challenges for, again, iconic species. So I don't deal with iconic species as a scientist, so I'm not going to talk about those. But what I'm going to talk about is really the connection between the physical processes at the surface of the ocean related to ice and ice coverage and the productivity by the unicellular organisms that drive the oceanic food webs. And of course, these are phytoplankton. So these are important. And there's a great review. Again, if you are interested, there's this paper by Matthew Ardina and Kevin Arrigo is really good. It really shows some very interesting trends. They really looked, they used satellite measurements, ocean color measurements from satellites from 1998 to 2018 to look at global oceanic Arctic Ocean processes. And really, they measure three major things. They measure open water area using satellites. They measure chlorophyll from space using chlorophyll fluorescence, and then using algorithms, they estimate net primary production. So that's the overall productivity that's seen from space through the satellite. So again, we're talking about surface ocean productivity primarily here. And they see some major trends. They see the increases in open water season increases, slight increase in chlorophyll, and what they see is a kind of steady increase of both chlorophyll and primary productivity. And they and others have dubbed this the greening of the Arctic, the fact that the Arctic is becoming greener. The loss of sea ice means that now you have more open water, you have more light, so you have a prolonged growing season that they and other authors have coined the greening of the Arctic. There's some interesting trends, and I don't want to deal too much in this, but sort of they see some differences between the past decades and the last decade in terms of some of these relationship between productivity and sea ice formation. Another paper that actually these authors is now Lewis et al. This is a science paper, is related to it and shows some of the underlying data, again, mostly using or primarily using satellite pictures. And the key thing is it shows a couple things. It shows that there's, if you look at the Arctic again from the top, you see the various Arctic margins that, so the Barents Sea, the Laptev Sea, Chukchi, and others. And they in this paper, they make some pretty important observations. One is the coastal areas, the marginal seas don't behave or behave differently in terms of how they're responding to open, decreased sea ice or more open water than the more open, deeper parts of the ocean basins. There's also large differences between different basins, different shelf basins. And so some of the areas here in red are the ones that I've shown. So this is the rate of change in chlorophyll. The highest increases have been both in the Barents Sea and the Chukchi Sea. Both of these are what we call inflow shelves because water circulates from the Atlantic into the Arctic and from the Pacific into the Arctic through these systems. And so they make some interesting points that, again, I'm going to kind of use as a way to present our data. And really the key things, some of the key mechanisms for these changes that are proposed by them and of course by many others is again, this prolonged growing season as sea ice is removed because more sea ice melts, you have more stratification. I'll talk a little bit in a minute how the surface of the ocean is a critical critical variable. If organisms, if photosynthetic organisms are mixed too deep into the ocean, they basically move out of the light zone, the euphotic zone, and so they can't photosynthesize. So stratification, meaning being able to reduce how deep organisms get mixed into the dark part of the ocean, is important. And then, of course, there's this vertical mixing of nutrients. We'll talk a little bit about the fact that how the season progresses, you need to be able to photosynthesize as a unicellular organism floating in the ocean. You need to be able to have light and nutrients together, and so the input of nutrients is critical. There's also some interesting trends associated with land-ocean margins, and the fact that, of course, as you have more melt also on land, there's increased river discharge. That river discharge can bring organic matter and nutrients that can prolong or increase productivity. And there's also some interesting new papers on aerosol deposition, especially associated with some of the forest fires in Arctic regions, and if whether or not those aerosols can actually provide additional nutrients to the surrounding ocean. Okay, so great paper to see, to read, and if you have a chance, definitely look at it. So we're going to focus in phytoplankton productivity, and I'm going to use Ardina and Arrigo paper has these nice cartoons that are really a nice way to sort of visualize the cycling of productivity in the Arctic Ocean. And again, the way I'm going to show a couple of these, the way they're organized is, Arctic night in January all the way to December through the Arctic summer, where you actually have light. And again, this is critical because without light you can have photosynthesis. So the key thing here is this is the traditional Arctic phenology. This is what we think things might have been going on maybe in the 80s and the 70s before we started seeing these large decreases in Arctic sea ice melt. So we had snow and sea ice, and again, if you have thick snow, if you have thick snow and sea ice, even if you have light, they basically don't provide for much light to penetrate into the water. And so even though these waters may have lots of nutrients, they are really, there's not enough light for them to react to photosynthesize. As snow ice in early spring snow starts to melt on top of the sea ice. One of the interesting things of Arctic productivity is we know that there's ice that grow beneath the ice, and they really become most abundant when the ice gets thin enough so that actually light can penetrate through it. There's plenty of nutrients in the water, so you get these under ice or ice algae blooms that are very important in parts of the Arctic. As the summer progresses and the sea ice breaks out, you have open water, and that creates, again, now you have full light all the way to the surface. You have open water, you have lots of nutrients in the water, and that leads to a phytoplankton blooms that occur sometimes under the ice, sometimes right at the ice edge as it retreats. As the season progresses, of course, that sea ice melts. Sea ice is fresh water. As it melts, it's actually doesn't completely mix with the saltier water below, and so you end up having what we call a density layer or a surface mixed layer. Density is primarily driven by temperature and salinity. In this case, the addition of cold, fresh water ends up creating a layer of brackish water, less saline water at the top, where then the phytoplankton can stay, right? The phytoplankton floats, and so they stay in the lighted area and basically can bloom. As they're growing and they're taking nutrients, dissolved nutrients, growing, either being eaten or settling into the sediments or towards the water column below. Basically, towards the end of the season, we have a depletion of nutrients, and that depletion of nutrients kind of breaks the ends the bloom, and the phytoplankton can't grow anymore. So go forward to sort of what we think is happening now, and is likely to happen more and more. Now we're talking about the new Arctic. Some of the key things that we see is there's less snow and ice, so the ice is thinner already. There's snow on top of it, and it melts quicker. So we have earlier blooms, so earlier ice algae blooms and early under ice blooms that happens now, not just in May and June, but they're starting to happen in May. There's the same kind of bloom conditions, right? You still have a longer sea ice melt. You have the same sort of stratification of the water column by the low salinity due to ice melt. But because we have lots more light, what happens, we think, is there's a earlier depletion of nutrients that happens much earlier in the season. And so because the growth is happening earlier, the surface waters run out of nutrients earlier. And so there's a period in the summer where that surface water that's really isolated from the bottom water that still has nutrients, the nutrients can't mix. And so you have a period of time where there's low productivity. And then because now sea ice doesn't form until October or later, we have the ability of certain processes like wind storms and other storms to actually break down that stratification and inject nutrients into the surface. And so there's idea that there might be fall blooms happening in the Arctic where we never really saw them before. And the other thing that's depicted here that's really interesting is the idea that, because there's lots of light during the summer that penetrates deeper, we see, and I'll show you if I can, we see this subsurface productivity that's happening during the summer period. So here in these deeper layers, the phytoplankton are very close to the nutrient source below. There's still enough light penetrating, and so we think we see productivity in the subsurface. Again, this productivity is not observed from satellite, so it's something that the discussion I just mentioned before just doesn't see. So, okay, so that's a good, probably too long of an introduction of Arctic biogeochemistry, Arctic ocean biogeochemistry, but sort of sets up the stage for what we're interested in, or myself and my colleagues are interested in. So this is kind of the new Arctic from the point of view of ocean carbon cycling and biogeochemistry and ecology. And so the focus of our research has been to try to, lots of work has been done in the early season by groups like Kevin Arrigo's groups and others, and what happens during as the sea ice melts earlier. We're interested in what's happened during that period of time in the late summer and fall when things are quite distinct because it's being an open water season for several months. We're interested in that. We're also interested in one of the marginal seas that's the most, I show some of the most productive areas, the Chukchi Sea, as being a very interesting place to do these studies. And so we have a couple of hypotheses, a hypothesis and alternate hypothesis. One that's being proposed by us and others is that the stratification, the salinity differences between the surface layer and that gets depleted of nutrients in the season and that deeper layer that still has nutrients is so high that there's very little chance for those nutrients to mix in during the open water season. So the open water season is likely to be less productive. Alternative, we think, which is what I'm going to try to show you, is there are locations and times and periods, conditions that allow for that stratification to be broken down enough for nutrients to flux into the surface layer where there's enough light and where the phytoplankton are just basically can react, take up those nutrients and prolong the productivity during the open water season throughout the summer. So I'm going to try to show you a little bit of data on that. And so again, just to give you a little bit of background on how we do this, because satellites have some issues associated with color coverage and the fact that they only see the surface, myself and others, we are interested in basically looking at conditions in the field and making measurements in the field. So here's a cartoon of basically what we're talking about, the nutrient cycling and productivity. So, dissolved nutrients come from the deeper parts of the water. If there's enough light, that nutrients and CO2 get made into particulate organic carbon and oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis, and some of that particulate organic carbon then can sink. The oxygen can escape through the atmosphere, and so we are focused. Myself and Lori's work are focused on two things and two traces: this particulate organic carbon productivity and also the oxygen production. So the two are two ways of actually trying to trace this productivity in surface waters. The focus of what I'm going to talk to you mostly about is just showing you some particular organic matter distributions and just using those. And I'm going to use POC, particular organic carbon concentrations, as tracers of productivity. And hopefully I'll have enough time to show you a little bit of data on the dissolved oxygen and normalized to argon that Lori's group has been working on, also as a tracer of productivity. Okay, so the outline of the talk is I'm going to show you data from the surface under wave system that we use to basically, as the ships move around the Arctic, continually capture or collect data and samples from the surface that allows us to kind of create maps or look at variability in the surface. And then if I have a little bit, should have a little bit of time to show you the oxygen argon ratios. Then if I do have a little bit of time, I'll show you a couple of teasers on what's happening in the subsurface. We use different techniques to collect samples deeper in the water column, and I can show you a little bit of data if we have time. Okay, so before we get that, I just want to sort of highlight a little bit about the Chukchi and Bering Chukchi Sea, what we call the Pacific Arctic. Again, if you look at a map, right, this is Alaska, there's the Bering Strait right here, here's Siberia. So what the first thing that it's important for everybody to understand when you think about this Arctic, Pacific Arctic, is the Chukchi Sea and the Bering Sea shelves, they're extremely shallow. So this is a, this is a bathymetric profile, right? Here's the Brooks Range in Alaska, the North Slope. Here's the Canadian Basin, right? The Beaufort Sea. There's basically the whole shelf, very broad shelf, it's less than 100 meters deep. So it's a very shallow sea, and one that by being so shallow and actually having bathymetric and sort of these controls like this strait, as currents move through this shallow sea, there is a lot of turbulence and mixing that happens, and that's going to be important. We know quite a bit about the currents that happens. Again, this is a very, very dynamic, from a physical oceanographic perspective. We have several currents that come through this sort of bottleneck. That's the Bering Strait. The Bering Strait is really the major gateway, well, the only gateway between the Pacific and the Arctic, and a key gateway to the Arctic Ocean. So we have, throughout the year, we have waters, the Anadyr water and Bering Sea waters coming through. We also have the Alaskan coastal water coming through. There's also the Siberian current, and these create currents that are actually fairly well established. The most interesting thing from an oceanographic perspective is that these different waters, different currents, have a specific, what we call water masses. So these are not like, well, kind of like rivers in the sea, but they are water masses that have very specific characteristics. They have typical temperature and salinity contrast, so we can recognize them when we are sailing aboard research vessels. They also have specific nutrient loads, and so as they move through the Arctic Ocean, they really impact the biogeochemistry and ecology of the region. Again, there's another, if you're interested in this paper by Seth Adelson that's really good in sort of illustrating these differences. Okay. The other thing I would say about the Pacific Arctic region is a really highly dynamic and ecologically and biogeochemically speaking, there's a lot of interest in understanding how it changes. So one of the things that I've highlighted here, this is from a paper by Jackie Grebmeyer, again, lots of interesting work. This shows you the March sea ice extent. So at the end of the winter, this is where the sea ice edge is located. And you can sort of see they have mapped from 1980 to 2018. And so that the winter sea ice edge that hasn't changed very much. The summer sea ice edge is the one that has really changed. Again, just to make the point, in the 80s, the sea ice at the end of the summer in September was around here. Right now, the sea ice at the end of September is right out here in general. So there's again, a very, very important change. And there again, there's quite a few processes in terms of the blooms that happen here early in the season and how it affects the ecology, because this is a very shallow shelf. Whatever is happening in the water column gets transported to the sediments very effectively, and so there's a lot of interest in also what's happened to the benthic communities in the Arctic as these changes are happening. Okay, I don't know how good your screens are, but really this is to illustrate sort of the bird's eye view, the satellite view of the Arctic Ocean, of the Chukchi Sea. And what you see, and maybe you can sort of see it, is you see that, so this is true color, so you can sort of see these sort of plumes of some of them might be sediment, like for example, out of these rivers, but a lot of these are like here, a lot of these are these lighter colors because they are basically phytoplankton. There are microscopic organisms with chlorophyll that show up in these true color images from MODIS that really illustrates how complex the productivity in the system are. There are fronts, so remember we're talking about different currents, so there are fronts that of different water masses, and along those fronts we see these productivity difference. There are plumes coming out of trailing out of these capes and different spatial features. Again, lots of plumes coming out of Bering Strait that suggest mixing and the physical oceanographic processes bring nutrients up to the surface, and that promotes productivity. A nicer way, or one way to do it, is to use the chlorophyll fluorescent algorithms that these satellites have to kind of highlight this variability. So this is one that shows chlorophyll concentrations in different color schemes, and really this sort of highlights these very complicated, intricate sort of eddies and fronts. You can sort of see, right where you see low chlorophyll right next to a high chlorophyll plume. You sort of see this plume with these eddies moving across as the Alaskan coastal current moves, from south to north. And kind of one of the key things I wanted to highlight is that there are these highly variable spatially and temporally regimes of productivity that are hard to measure when you just go to one place at the same, in just a single location. But we see some kind of major difference between, for example, these sort of near coast areas downstream from major, like Point Hope, for example, versus the more open Arctic Ocean, where really we see very little productivity in the surface. So highly complicated, highly complex, and so one of the challenges to do in situ sampling under these conditions is that you have to be able to do a high spatial resolution of sampling. And again, if you've ever been on a traditional boat-based oceanographic or lake-based work, the idea is you take your boat, you go to your station, you stop, you lower a water bottle, you take a sample, you bring it back, you filter it, and that's how you use it. So that takes a lot of time. It's hard to do high resolution sampling using that way. So we've been using the fact that most research vessels now have what we call a science underway water system. So they take water from somewhere surface below the surface. So in the case, for example, the Sikuliks, about 6 meters below the water line. That water is being pumped, get pumped through some strainers to get rid of large particulate materials and things like that. And then what it does is that it's brought in an unpolluted way, in a clean way up to the labs where scientists are able to actually access that water on a regular basis. So these pumps are going the whole time. They're constantly moving water from the surface to the labs and out. And so what we've been using for the past few years, have been set up this sort of semi-automatic filtration system. It's made out of a series of filter screens that we set up in line, and so the water comes through, and at specific times, every 20 minutes, every 15 minutes, every hour, depending on what we do, we take a sample, we measure the volume, we take the sample. That sample basically is capturing whatever biomass is pressing into surface waters, and we can do hundreds and hundreds of these samples as we move along. Most of the time, we're doing other things in the ship. We're still doing subsurface sampling and other things, but by having this semi-automated system, we can do that. The nice thing, and I'll show you the dissolve, some of the dissolve gas data, is that most ships have multiple taps, and so you can have a particulate sampler, we can have a dissolved gas measurement, we can measure CO2 underway, we can measure dissolved oxygen and argon underway, we can do now dissolved nutrients underway. So we are developing these approaches to basically, as the ships are moving across these study areas, constantly getting samples and data that we can use to understand how the system is changing or the system is evolving, especially in these very complicated systems like we just saw with that overview from the satellite becomes very difficult to not to do it any other way. Okay, so so I'm going to show you data from 4 cruises all through the late season, so fall and summer. In 2012, I sailed on the Healy. This is the icebreaker that the Coast Guard has. In 2015, we sailed on the Ron Brown, it's a NOAA vessel, in August, and then in 2016 and 2017, we sailed on the Sikuliak, which is University of Alaska Fairbanks vessel, UNOLS vessel. And then the only other thing I want to do is not only, you know, I show you some pictures of kind of the variability, spatial variability. That spatial variability is driven a lot by circulation and physical processes. And so what I'm showing here is graphs of wind conditions. So easterly winds at Point Barrow, which is located, it's a Met station located in the northmost part of Alaska, you know, at the eastern side of the Chukchi Sea between the Chukchi and the Beaufort. And this is wind data for August, September, and November, and I just extracted the east-west wind speed. So, so again, negative U is easterly winds coming from the east. In this part of the Chukchi Shelf, east winds are pushing water opposite to the general circulation, and it's actually causing water to move offshore, creating what we call upwelling. So these negative east-west wind periods are periods in which we expect water to be moved away from the coast and actually have what we call upwelling, which is important because, of course, upwelling can bring nutrients up to the surface. Again, lots of information here. All I want to say, and these boxes illustrate the period of time when we were offshore. And I'm going to show you transects going from south to north, from Nome or from the Bering Sea into the Chukchi, and then from north to south in the return. So I'm going to show you pictures of both. And it just illustrates how variable things are, right? For example, this 2015, we had upwelling, and then we had a big storm that came through, and we had the opposite. We had downwelling conditions, pretty significant wind speeds. And so it again, it sort of shows you or illustrates just how variable and dynamic conditions are in this part of the ocean, the Arctic Ocean. Okay, so here's a couple of pictures. So I'm going to show you several of these maps. These are, I'm going to show you first salinity, just to show you what the water masses look like. And I'm going to, what I'm showing you is I'm showing you data that are associated with the, you know, so with this automated sampling device, what we do is we'll filter, for example, every 20 minutes, we filter for 2 minutes. And what I'm showing you is the salinity and temperature in a minute of the water that went through that filter. So I'm going to show you both salinity, temperature, and then the POC concentrations of specific water samples. And so all these data are from the same water, right? Salinity, temperature, and POC. And this just shows you that as we moved from south to north in the way up, we encountered different salinity waters. We got to some lower salinity here by Kotzebue Sound and Point Hope. And then as we went up, we encountered some sea ice actually on a little bit of the sea ice edge here. And so we can sort of see a little bit of less salty water up there. So that's October 2012 to September 2015. Our automated filtration system was not automated that time. And so we were doing manual samples. And so that kind of illustrates what happens when you are not doing manual. You have less data density, but again, kind of showing, in this case, salinity is about 30, 31. Here's September 2016. Again, large differences as we move across into the Chukchi. And then we encounter, actually, there was pack ice right here. We couldn't move very far north from there just because their pack ice was just sitting there. So we saw some low salinity waters up there associated with that. In the way back, we did some transects to do other kind of work, and then we came back down. And then September, and this is August 2017, we never saw sea ice during that time, and the pack ice was way up north, and the salinity was actually quite high and uniform. Okay, so this is just to show you that for these 4 different years, kind of similar seasons, we actually just looking at the color schemes, not without paying too much attention, see quite large variations. This is the temperature signature of the same water masses. So again, we have thermistors at the intake of the ship. And so as the water is being pumped, is making measurements. And so you can sort of see, for example, in 2012, we encountered very cold water throughout most of the study area. The opposite in 2015. In 2016, because we found sea ice and we encountered sea ice, there's a lot of meltwater from the sea ice that's cold. So you see cold temperatures. And then in 2017, we actually saw some of the warmest temperatures ever recorded in this part of the world, exceeding 15 degrees C off Nome. In fact, it was swimming weather of Nome, and some of us did go swimming because the water was actually so warm. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about POC in a minute. I just want to give you sort of basically a view of what these water masses tells us. So just to show you the water masses that we measure, we oceanographers often think about these water masses in terms of salinity temperature profiles. And so this highlights the fact that each cruise that we did, we sampled different water masses. So for example, in 2012 on the Healy, we were mostly occupying part of the water, part of the system of the Chukchi Sea was filled with meltwater, and some of these summer water that had undergone some changes. Whereas, for example, in 2015 and 2016, especially, a lot of the area that we occupied with the ship actually had Alaskan coastal water, much warmer water in it. So when we look at the POC in a minute, you have to keep that in mind. Each cruise, we are sampling the same location, but because the water is moving constantly, we're actually sampling different regimes. Okay, so here's the POC data. I need to go a little faster, so hopefully it won't go too. So this is the 2012 Healy data. Again, the concentrations of POC or millimoles per meter cube or micromolars go from 0 to over, actually, I'll show you some data to go over even 35. So just to show you 20 micromolar, that's a fairly productive, that's somewhat green water, right? This amount of POC means that it's very clear, very low particulate material biomass. So 2012, large parts of the Chukchi were very low biomass, right? Remember, this is where the meltwater was located. So very little productivity in this cruise. In 2015, we saw some higher values exceeding 50 micromolar in places around here and in some of the nearshore regions. In 2016, we saw again much higher resolution than we saw as you move from Nome up north. Large contrast in the standing stock of biomass. So we see very high concentrations in some areas, and then as we got up north into that meltwater region, we saw very relatively low. And again, 2017, we saw some of the highest concentrations we'd ever seen. The surface, again, very high concentrations of Point Hope, for example, over up to 65 micromolar. So really, really productive waters that we saw. So a couple of summary slides. The first one, if you think about in terms of spatial terms, so what I show here is the data for the 4 cruises divided, whisker plots divided in latitude regimes. So that's between Nome and Bering Strait, between Bering Strait at Point Hope, between Hope and Point Wainwright, up to 70 degrees north, and then above Point Barrow in 74. You sort of see lots of variability, right? In general, you tend to see lower concentrations in the northern reaches of the Chukchi and higher concentrations in the southern parts. You also see large differences between seasons and years. Again, useful but not super useful information. And that's because, of course, we're sampling different water masses. We're basically sampling different seascapes. We often call seascapes rather than landscapes, right? The water mass defines the product, the environment in that pelagic environment. And so it's useful to instead think about using the same salinity temperature plots that I show you to characterize water mass. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the data plotted, but now using POC as a color scale, right? To show you. So here's the Healy data set. And again, the Healy data set, remember, we were primarily occupied waters that were meltwater and this sort of summer water that has been somewhat changed. And what you see is that these are relatively low, and it's not until we get up to these very few samples where we actually are talking about this summer water where we start seeing some higher concentrations. The 2015 data, we mostly saw Alaskan coastal water and the summer water, and you see the highest concentrations are in this more dense Alaskan coastal waters. Here's the 2016 data, again, sort of showing some of the differences, and here's the 2017 data. And again, a couple of things that come out of this is there are very large differences in the concentrations of POC depending on the water mass that we sample. So the spatial differences are largely associated with water mass differences. And what we actually see here, the key thing that we see is we see some very high levels. The highest levels of biomass, standing stocks of biomass occur in this sort of colder, denser Alaskan coastal water and sort of warmer and slightly less dense Bering summer water. So these are the kinds of water masses that we expect are created, are formed partially through mixing between layers. And so we think that this is a important suggestion that this is being caused by upwelling or some sort of wind mixing, current mixing events. So that's POC. So how does the POC relate to other tracers? And so this is where I'd like to spend maybe 5 minutes showing you a little bit of the data. So here's the same type of map that we showed before. I'm just going to highlight the 2017 data. So this is the oxygen, dissolved oxygen argon ratio in that same water that is being pumped from 6 meters into the shelf. So Lori has a mass spec that's measuring oxygen argon concentrations in the water on a regular basis. And by normalizing the argon, the oxygen concentration to argon, basically she's able to take apart or normalize the effects of different temperatures and different solubility. So this oxygen argon ratio is primarily an indicator of biologic productivity and excess biologic oxygen production. And again, so here's the 2017, some very high supersaturation. So this is the saturation relative to saturation, and you just sort of see that you get very high concentrations. Just to show you what the POC looks like. So the same sample, the same profile ship track, you see the highest POC concentrations above about 40 micromolar in these regions where you actually she also shows the saturation ratio. Here's the second part. Her instrument was on as we were doing some of these other transects, and sort of shows the northern part had lower saturations, still above saturation, so some productivity. My POC data is not as, we actually had to switch the instrument to do other things, but you can sort of see there are some also differences. Here's the whole thing. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to show you how I interpret or how we interpret these compositions from the point of view of productivity. So here's a map. There's the south to north transect, the high supersaturated waters in terms of oxygen argon, and the high POC waters around here. So I'm going to show you data, how we interpret this data. So the average supersaturation in this region is about 25%. So that means that there's 25% excess oxygen relative to what you expect just if that water was in equilibrium with the atmosphere, right? Because we know what the concentration, the saturation concentration of oxygen is, we can actually calculate how much oxygen is being produced. What's the level of production of oxygen? So we find that there's about, on average, 72 millimoles per kilogram cube of excess oxygen due to biologic production in these waters. If you know the oxygen, the photosynthetic ratio between oxygen production and carbon synthesis is about 106 to 138 in moles per moles, we can estimate that it's about that these waters in general have a production, an excess biologic production of about 55 millimoles per kilogram. If you look at what we're measuring, we're actually measuring about that. We're measuring about 50 millimoles per kilogram, right? So it suggests that these two tracers are tracing the same process of productivity. Here's a blow up. So what I've done is I've taken the data from just below the Bering Strait all the way up to about 71 degrees north, and so that's the axis. And here, what I've shown is I'm showing the oxygen argon ratio that I show you in the map. So this is in green. The estimate of net community production that Lori comes out with in terms of rates, what's required to keep up those supersaturations in terms of oxygen productivity, and then in red, the POC concentrations. And what you see is when you start looking at more detailed pictures, you actually see there they are, right? As we move north, we see areas where you have peak in oxygen production and peak in POC production or biomass. You see another peak associated with us. So that's that area here, right? You have high levels of oxygen production and high levels of biomass. And then a second peak north of Point Hope, again, when we see that. So this allows us to kind of get a pretty good idea of how things are changing. It also points to certain areas where there's a decoupling between the dissolved oxygen tracer and the particular organic matter tracer. That's interesting. That suggests it's an area where there's production, but the biomass has been removed through sinking or settling from the surface water, which is also quite interesting for us. Okay, so the take-home messages, we've been able to do quite a large number of POC samples using this approach, much greater frequency, much higher resolution than before. We're seeing these large differences that seem to be related to areas where you have either mixing because of currents interacting with bathymetry or with the geographical features like capes, or, and I really didn't talk too much about it, associated with wind events, which is the thing that we also found. And then we really, most interesting is we're seeing a general agreement between these different tracers. So the production of excess oxygen through photosynthesis seems to be coupled fairly well, with some differences or some areas where there's contrast with argon, with the particular organic carbon. So I'm running out of room. So we are now working, or I'm working. We are all working in subsurface processes, and so we're interested in looking at how this production, how these same tracers of productivity behave, but not just in the surface, but actually in subsurface. And so I'll just give you a quick teaser of what we're seeing. We're seeing very interesting features. We're seeing, so here's data. So these are transects. This is from the 2016 cruise. We did a transect from Barrow Canyon north to Hannah Shoal and then off to the east. So each of these dots represent a station where we stop with lower instruments, lower water sampling devices, and then came back up. And this is what the contour plots show. And so the first thing you show is we show a very highly stratified water column, right? So low salinity water at the top and high salinity water at the bottom over Hannah Shoal. We show what the light, the radiance is, right? So we see during the daylight hours, we see light penetrating all the way to the pycnocline, and then the nightlight hours. So you can sort of see the day and light area. And what we see in terms of some of these tracers, we see, for example, sort of intermediate levels, these subsurface levels of high chlorophyll that suggest this is where production is happening. And furthermore, we see these layers where you actually have very high oxygen concentrations, supersaturation of oxygen. Much like we're seeing in some of the locations in the surface, we're seeing across in an area where the surface doesn't necessarily show much productivity, the subsurface is showing tracers of production that we're quite interested in following. Okay, so I'm going to sort of stop here since I'm gone a little long, and just to highlight the what my lab is doing, and what others are doing. And if you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them.
Cool. Thanks, Miguel.
Sure.
Really cool data. Lots to think about. Questions from the group? Pretty nice audience. We had a few join. So I'm kind of curious, right? My interest is broadly in atmospheric carbon cycling. And I'm trying to link what your work tells us about air-sea fluxes of CO2, right? Because if there's something like a deep productive maxima, like does that matter for air-sea exchange, or is that kind of more about in-water processes? And perhaps I'm just maybe not thinking about it properly.
No. I mean, that's so that subsurface production. Really, it's important in terms of exchanges with the atmosphere, exchanges with others. From the point of view of, for example, that supersaturation of oxygen that occurs at that layer is also followed by a undersaturation. So there's CO2 being uptake, right? So that water mass is basically isolated from the surface until you start forming sea ice. When you start forming sea ice, you have cooling. So that whole water mass then becomes well mixed over the winter season. So any processes or any signatures, any changes that are happening in the subsurface, eventually, especially in shallow seas like the Chukchi, eventually sort of get communicated to the surface by having this mixed layer happening. And so, right, the production of organic matter, the respiration, all those processes that are subsurface tend to then get mixed in once you have winter overturning. And so if you have excess production of oxygen, that high oxygen water potentially can reach the atmosphere. Same thing with the low CO2 levels, right? So, so in shallow, I mean, these are 40, 50, 60 meter shelves. They basically get turned over completely every year during the winter time.
Yeah, so that's maybe not unlike the types of dynamics we might see in a lake like Mendota that campus is on, that's eutrophic and freezes, but is less than 30 meters deep.
Right. There's some interesting dynamics that happen once you have an ice cap, and you probably know about these, of course. Interesting things in terms of how dissolved gases might or might not exchange. And so because of course you're changing both salinity and temperature at the same time, you're also changing solubility of these gases. And so it doesn't mean that all this excess oxygen goes up to the atmosphere, because you're cooling the water, so you're making the water, the solubility of oxygen increase. And so there's some interesting processes that happen.
Cool. Are there questions from the audience? Unmute or chat or raise hand.
That went very fast.
No, it's. I mean, as you get a sense, we're just kind of getting back into oceanography here in Wisconsin, and there's some questions for sure about things that we still have to kind of figure out. One of the things I was interested in following up, you mentioned emerging Arctic, and you just mentioned the importance of ice and kind of this mixing multiple times a year that occurs at the onset and offset of ice. And then I just saw on the news today, right, that, one of the first icebreakers went through being able to ship from China out across the Arctic. Is there an effect on, is there a potential for a risk for something more like mid-latitude oceans, where you have a permanently stratified layer or something like that? Or do you think there always will still be this mixing process occurring?
Yeah, my understanding, I'm not an expert. My understanding is some of the models suggest like 2050 there'll be a ice-free Arctic in the summer, and then still form ice in the winter. Some of the ecological aspects of that, of course, is that the thick ice. It's the multi-year ice is sort of an endangered species, if you will, and so that multi-year ice provides habitat for certain species. It provides it's a way to seed ice growth. There's lots of effects that are happening as you go from a permanent ice cover to a seasonal ice cover. The fact that you're now are able to bring, I think there was a question I saw about fisheries. The fact that you're able to have ships now go through Northwest Passage or go through areas that previously were just not worth it because there was so much ice breaking. That, of course, is having all sorts of impacts, ecological all the way to social, and there's really no deep water ports in Alaska, so, but that might change as more traffic goes through, right? And so communities are interested in that. There was a question about fisheries. So one of the interesting things as we're seeing, physical and chemical variables sort of migrate north with the water, same thing is happening with species. So there are species that are moving from the Bering Sea, and Bering Sea is a super rich environment, right? World's most dangerous catch, pollock and crab and so on. A lot of those species are moving north, and so there are now more and more potential exploitation of fisheries up in parts where before the species didn't reach. And so there's a lot of economic, social, of course, cultural. A lot of the native communities that live along those coastlines are are having to adapt to all these changes. So lots of
Yeah.
interesting things.
Curious.
One of the interesting things that I think mentioned, just to follow, in terms of fisheries, if there's productivity later in the year, that potentially has a pretty significant impact on sort of food webs later in the year. And so there's lots of interest in understanding that, how that later production is going to affect, zooplankton, larval fish, marine mammals, all those things. This is something that still is being, lots of people are doing that kind of research from that point of view, because it's a change and it will affect different species differently. I mean, that's
Interesting. Yeah. It makes me think about the Great Lakes and its history of invasive species and how with additional shipping, you might have an interesting shift from there.
yeah. I mean, I know that we're running late, but I'll just plug we have a project right now. The one thing that is sort of have caught people's attention is there are harmful algae that grow. Most of those harmful algae are, require certain temperatures, and so they drift with the current. And then when they get to the Arctic, they just basically go into a prolonged, dormant stage, because you just can't germinate, especially the dinoflagellates. And what we're finding now is with this increased temperatures that there's more and more cases of some of these harmful algal blooms happening, primarily associated with the fact that there's just warmer temperatures. And so these species can now, they're invasive from the point of view that they're never really being active in these cold waters. And so as the waters warm up, especially during the late summer, they're becoming more prevalent. And that's causing lots of, people are worrying about that, because of course we don't, a lot of the communities there depend on shellfish and other phytoplankton consumers for their food. And so, just like we have shellfish warnings and, in all the temperate oceans and probably freshwaters in North America, we're now probably going to have the same thing in the Arctic waters, just because of the change.
Interesting. Cool. Well, there's one quick question I came in chat. Maybe if we can do the 1 minute wrap up on that, and then we'll the changes in ocean circulation that you've witnessed related to the field work you've done.
Yeah. So there's a very interesting topic. If you read that Ardina review paper, there's been a lot of work in just understanding how circulation is happening. So in the Pacific Gateway, almost everybody agrees that there's been an increase in transport from the Pacific to the Arctic. And that's driven basically because the Arctic, in a way, it's almost like an estuary, right? I mean, it behaves very much like a giant estuary. And that's another driver for change, is that there is actually an enhanced south to north movement of water, transport of water. That water brings, different salinity, different nutrients, but also brings warmer water. So there's a feedback that's happening in the Arctic that over large periods of time. And so there's a very interesting questions about how those large circulation changes will cascade into, ecological changes. That, super interesting area of research. Most of that work cannot be done from ships going out, every season. You need moorings and satellites and models, and so that's a little beyond my area of expertise. But some of the papers that are out there are showing there's some very large changes happening. I don't know if that answers the question, but
cool. Well, certainly plenty of things to think about.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Miguel.
All right.
Taking time. Good chatting, and of course, recording will be shared broadly with the community as well. Right. For those who are still here, my speaker for next month had to cancel, so we actually have a little bit of delay before our next speaker, but our next speaker will be Min Chen, a new faculty at UW at Forest and Wildlife Ecology. He's a modeler, but works on Arctic terrestrial ecosystems, and so we will take a look at maybe some similar sets of questions, maybe some different questions, but over ecosystems on land. And so stay tuned for that.
All right.
Cool. All right.
Thanks so much for the invite. Nice to see you.